Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Azaii Calderon Muniz.
Good evening / morning / afternoon. I realized I was going to say good morning, but it's not necessarily morning when people are listening to this. Good end of the year is maybe a better way. Last week, I'm like, my words are getting mixed up. Last week was our Christmas episode. And so I'm no longer dressed as festive, and Azai's tree has absconded and hidden. But I want to welcome everyone. This is our last podcast episode of 2021. I'm pretty excited. We just started this year. We're ending the year of the first, the podcast here, and that's pretty exciting. We are not ending our run through of the psych outline. See that segue there? That worked really well. So we're nearing the end. We're close to the end. We're going to talk about some terms from 8C. Notice things are moving way faster in the tail end of this outline. And that's just the way that it naturally is, because the first sections are by far the most complex. I think we did four or five episodes on 7A. And so now it's pretty much just one episode per section. So we're in 8C. We're hitting some big things with roles and impressions and how we manage this, as well as some of my favorite terms like McDonaldsization and the Iron Law of Oligarchy. But before we jump into that, Azaii, pop question here. I kind of feel bad. I always throw questions at you. You have no idea this question's coming. Do you have any big New Year's resolutions or things like that? Anything going on with that?
Yeah. So actually a friend was just asking me about that last night. And I think some of the two biggest ones, and actually, I guess two people asked me about that last night, are to make more time for myself and to make more time for the people that I care about and love in my life. I realized that this past year has basically been a blur between med school, between working, between, trying to juggle the last strands of a personal life that I have. Mm-hmm. And I realized I didn't get to take that time. And I realized that the way that I've been going is actually not sustainable, in terms of clinic, of really anything. And so my two biggest resolutions are those, to make sure that I have something left to give, and to make sure that the people in my life know how much I care about them, and to make time for them. How about yours?
Oh, that's so heartwarming. I was going to say I want to do sit-ups or something. That's yours is way better of a resolution. I definitely think that is absolutely a good thing to just be aware of, is to think about the time and socialization, especially with the last couple of years with COVID. Obviously, everyone is kind of, sequestered in their own little nook of the world. And especially MCAT students. I can't imagine trying to study for the MCAT and during COVID, and just during the MCAT, I already hid from the world and just shackled myself to a stack of books, and that was not sustainable. But I can't imagine COVID on top of that. So I think that's a good resolution for you, and probably for most people, myself included. So I'm just going to steal yours. So just making more time, that really is a big thing, and just being aware of that. I'm excited. I planned some stuff with family and friends, and I'm gonna make this happen, and making that a priority. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah. So speaking of, letting your life take over part of who you are, another great segue. We're going to be talking about roles as one of the first sections here in 8C. And so a role is I hate to use the word in its own definition, any role that you fit into. And so you might be cast as a role as a student, or a physician, or a child, or a parent, or a friend, right? Or a teacher, right? For myself. And so having these roles that you fit into, and these roles that help you shape your life, and that do help shape your life. This is a big part of just being a person. However, issues can occur within these roles. And so one of the first issue is something called role strain, which is when you like struggle to fit into a role. The classic example I use for this is like somebody who wants to be like a world-class physicist, but they're like really bad at math, right? Like that is very difficult. You're going to experience some strain there because that role is something you are going to struggle to fit. And some roles are just more difficult roles. Like the role of a medical student is a much more strenuous role than the role of I'm like trying to figure out what else. Oh, well, like who should I slam here? A dental student? No. Just like, like a medical student's life that's a lot harder to fit than like a traditional undergrad, for example. And so there are these roles, these things that we struggle to fulfill. And some roles are just harder than others, but also some people are just better suited for certain roles. That's something I think about a lot. Like I love teaching. I love talking about science stuff. I like learning new things and spreading that knowledge, like increasing the global human knowledge by like learning stuff and spreading it, is like such a great, fulfilling thing to me. And like for a long time, like I did not pursue careers that fit that. And I was pursuing careers where I would be like not necessarily like educating, but like working as a lab tech or things like that. And like that is not playing to my strengths, like the stuff that I'm good at, the stuff that I like doing. And so I could do those things, but there was some strain there because I wanted to be like social. I wanted to talk to people. I wanted to learn new things. And so just doing the same PCR like for 6 months, like people are just giving me stuff and I'm just doing PCRs and like, I don't even know what they're researching. Like that was not a good role for me. And so understanding this like role strain could be based on the role being difficult, or it could also be due to a bad fit, I think is an important thing. And so if any of you guys are struggling with a role, be aware that doesn't mean that you're bad, right? Or like, I know this is something that like when I like try to do something and I'm not good at it, it kind of makes me feel bad about myself, but that's because I was trying to do things that I was not like, didn't match who I was as a person. Yeah, sorry, like went on a long tangent there. Like you guys are basically my therapist and I'm just like opening up about like my life overall.
Well, hopefully our listeners appreciate that, because there's definitely a vulnerability to what we do, whether we want to admit it or not. But I think you brought up something really important, whether I think more hinted at it. But with these roles, right, there are these set of expectations, right, of behaviors, of what you should be able to accomplish. And I want to point out, I know some students have struggled with kind of a schema versus a role. And so with schemas, right, it's more what you picture, it's more like representative examples, right, where with role, it's a little bit more tangible with behaviors. But I think the role strain is important because, like you said, it doesn't inherently mean that you're bad at something, right? But there are things within this role that are tugging at you, and they might be, pulling you in different directions. So for example, in medical school, you guys can't escape my talking about this. But there are these different roles, right? So I have the role within the role, this expectation of studying for the national, shelf exams in preparation for patients. There's this expectation that I will call my patients, even when I'm not in clinic, to follow up with them for my longitudinal patients. There's this expectation that if one of my patients ends up in the hospital, right, or is in labor, I go, right? And then this other expectation of when I'm in clinic, trying to provide care and tie all of this together. And you can't do most of those things at the same time. You just can't. Right. So you're being tugged in these different directions. And again, like you said, it doesn't inherently mean that I'm awful at all of these things, but there's just this constant need to do a lot. Similar to that, but different, is role conflict. So with role strain, it's within the same role, right? Of medical student, of pre-med student, of child, of employee. But with role conflict, it's two or more roles that have expectations that are clashing. So for example, working and school, right? And I know a lot of you are also, students studying for the MCAT, and some of you are also working. Some of you have children and families, et cetera. And these different roles are requiring your time, right? So studying for school and being able to keep up with assignments, writing papers, completing problem sets, but then making time to study for the MCAT. When are you going to do your CARS passage? When are you going to do your daily science passage, which you can get on the Jack Westin website? When are you going to have time to call your family, right? All of these things, they're requiring a certain time. And it can be hard to fulfill multiple roles at once. And so that's really the gist of role conflict. So I think the way that I like to think about this is strain is specific to one, right? Conflict is clashing. And so that can be a way to help differentiate the two. But I think everyone on some level experiences both of these, right?
Yeah.
And so recognizing them can be really important. And when you have these clashing roles, there might be something that comes after that.
Yeah, I do want to take a second before we talk about the last one, which is role exit. And you know what? Let's talk about that one, and then I'm going to loop back around. Role exit is leaving a role. Just it's pretty much straightforward. It's like tapping out. Like, no, I'm out of here. Now, there's lots of ways to have role exit, like you graduated med school, like you are no longer a med student, you have exited that role. That's kind of like a natural progression. Most of the time when we talk about role exit, though, it's like due to role conflict or role strain. Like somebody who decides like being a physician is not really like what fits me well. And so I'm leaving that role and exiting that role and leaving med school after the second year. I'm definitely not being specific here. But this like leaving like a certain role, I think about like, I know that this is probably not the greatest example, like as a person, but I think about like parents who leave, like a father who leaves, like a family, like maybe that role they were experiencing so much strain trying to be a father in this that they end up just leaving. They go out for milk and then disappeared. And so that is a very clear example of role exit, like exiting this role of a father. I do think that there's a couple of other interesting things. Just role conflict. Like you said, like everyone experiences some of these. I think role conflict is an incredibly powerful like problem for medical students and physicians, right? And that's because being a physician is such a big role. Like the amount of stuff that's expected on you, like there's the amount of stuff that it engulfs in your life, and medical student as well, right? Like you can't really be a medical student and also have a full-time job. And like that is like, there might be some people out there who do that and they are superhuman, but like you can't do that and also have like I'm also dating and like other stuff and like all of these things. Like it's weird that like being a medical student makes it hard to date, makes it hard to like have significant others and things like that. And that's because of this conflict. It even makes it hard. Like a specific example from my time in medical school is I remember having like this very like awful feeling because I was in medical school. And I was out of state. So I was far away from my family. And my mom also had a very big birthday, like a very important birthday. And the weekend of my mom's birthday was also like the weekend before a Monday test that was really critical. And so I'm in this situation, like I want to go home for my family and be there, like for my mom for her birthday. And like, it's a big birthday and like, we should be celebrating this. But also I'm like, I need to be studying like the entire weekend and like, I don't have time. And so there's this conflict between being a good son and being a good medical student. And like, these things are in constant conflict. And this is such a big problem for medical students, but also physicians. Like physicians all the time. Like, let's say you're a physician and you're also a parent, right? Like, I really want to go to my kid's clarinet solo, but also there's someone on the table dying in front of me, right? Like, do I just say like, sorry, dude, you're dying. I'm going to listen to a bad playing of a clarinet. Like that's probably not okay. And so it's this interesting thing where a lot of times, especially being a physician or a medical student, that role starts to engulf you a little bit, and it starts to kind of like make it so that you, like, because of all the role conflict, that you can't invest as much time into these other roles as you would like to. This is why all my friends who like got married in medical school and things like that, their spouses like had to like recognize that they were secondary. And I feel like that's a very tricky position to be in, to be like, oh, your med school is more important than our relationship. And that sounds horrible, but that's kind of a viewpoint that like most people I know who had successful relationships in med school, they kind of went into this like, listen, like, I'm sorry, but like, I have to do this for the next couple of years and it's going to engulf me. And like, we may not be able to go out for our anniversary because we have a test the next day or something like that. And that's kind of a big issue. Something that I think a lot of times people don't think about that much, that role, like how much a certain role can start to cause conflict with others. Certainly you guys who are studying for the MCAT can relate to this. There are times when I was not a good friend because I was like too busy studying for the MCAT. And I'm like, sorry, like I know, like I know we haven't like hung out in a couple of weeks, but like I need to study because I have a test coming up, and yeah, it's a month away, but still, sorry, I can't go out and party on Saturday and then Sunday also. Like I just can't do it. So that's something that's just kind of interesting, like how like medicine can engulf and squeeze out other roles.
Yeah, I've definitely had preceptors who have had to pause between patients and pick up a phone call, because they're parents and they have to, if their children call, they have to figure out what's going on, prioritize, triage, and I think that that's something that's important to recognize. And I agree with you. It can be, being a med student can definitely make things a little bit harder. But like you said, right, it's darn near impossible to be a full-time employee, like have a full-time job and be a med student. Just for reference, so people recognize what you're getting yourselves into. You're expected, like you have 80-hour weeks in medical school. Right now, we're expected to be available 6 days a week in my program. So it's demanding, right? But the idea that people, so, even with this role strain, even with role conflict, part of the reason people stay is because they expect the outcome to be worth it, right? But then you might find yourself in a situation of role exit, either voluntarily or involuntarily, right? So in my case, when I had to leave medical school for a year, it was an involuntary role exit, because there really wasn't that option. It had to be done, right? But then, if someone, like you said, is finding that it's not fulfilling for them to be in a situation, then there can be a voluntary role exit. And kind of segueing, when you have these roles, right, a part of these roles is figuring out how you want to present yourself in these roles, right? And there's this idea of impression management that you will do your best to control how other people perceive you. And so, with impression management, again, we started talking about medical school, so we just end up there.
Yeah.
But with impression management, right, the way you present yourself to patients, right, you're expecting yourself to be composed, et cetera, might be different than the way you present yourself to preceptors, right, in a place of learning, whereas you want to have a little bit more, seem like you have a little bit more experience with patients, right, when you're seeing them. So you definitely, within these roles, there's definitely the some impression management going on as well.
Yeah, I really like just the idea of impression management. I think a lot of times people see impression management, which is like, I'm trying to create this image. A lot of times people see it as like lying and deceitful and things like that. And like, it definitely doesn't have to be. You are managing impressions just all the time, kind of no matter what, like with how you're dealing with this. And examples of that, like you have friends and you have teachers and you like probably have parents, and you don't act the same around all of them. And like, I guarantee you, there are some jokes that I would say with my friends that I would not say in front of my mom. And I would not say it in front of my patients either. And like, understanding that, like, oh, there's these impressions that we're managing, we're trying to balance all of them. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're lying. It's just you kind of emphasize different components as you are going through these different areas. And so I like try to cultivate like, oh, I'm a great student, or I'm really fun to be around for my friends, or like, you know, kind of whatever, like going through each of these scenarios. I also think like there's some funny examples. Like it's like, oh, I've got these two groups of friends and they see me as very different. And I'm like, what do I do with those? Like that's like that role management or impression management is that like challenging thing that like, what happens when I like at a graduation party, like all of my friends and my coworkers and my parents and my boss are all in the same place. Like, how am I supposed to act? Because like I have all of these that are starting to create some issues with that. I always think like, you know, like this, I knew a guy in high school that pretended to have a British accent because like he only around certain people because he thought it made him more attractive. And so like this thing like occurred, and like some girls were coming over. It's like, hey, like if I start talking with a British accent, don't point it out. Like don't act like it's weird. And so like they like these girls come out and he starts talking differently. And I'm like, all right, well, like that's like my favorite example of impression management there. And that one probably is a little bit lying deceitful, but like that doesn't mean that impression management is inherently. It's just that's my favorite example because he would start to talk. It was actually like not even a good impression. Like it would like switch between kind of Australian and like German, and I'm like, okay, I feel like you're kind of confused, but like luckily, you know, we're in rural Missouri, so nobody really knows what English sounds like or British.
Yeah. So I that's interesting that that you bring that up, because this, you know, pretending, I agree that there's definitely some deceitfulness going on there. I think it's still possible to have situations where it's not deceitful, right? Where you present different aspects of yourself. So this idea of like the and I'm probably going to mispronounce this, but the dramaturgical approach, right? Of how you present yourself. So this kind of like front stage situation where you're taking a look at how you like how you present yourself, like we've been talking about, but you also have this backstage self where, you know, that's who you are when there aren't as many people around. And this can be something where very few people see that aspect of you, right? So you can also have situations that aren't entirely mutually exclusive.
Yeah. I like the front stage versus backstage. Just to be clear, like front stage is just how you present yourself to other people. Backstage is like if you're not presenting to anybody and like you're just a little bit different in those cases. A good example of that is like when I am teaching, I have to like turn it on, like the energy, like the you know the fun. I want to make it edutainment, educational and entertaining at the same time. But like sometimes I'll like meet with a student and then another student, and then I teach a class, and then so like all of a sudden for like 4 or 5 hours I've been like on like song and dance, entertaining, isn't physics awesome? And then I'll like end and I'm just like, oh, I'm tired. Like it's just like a long day. And like it's not necessarily that I'm lying, but I'm just trying to create this impression because I want to keep people excited, because like science is awesome and like it is exciting and it's something that I care a lot about. But also like sometimes I'm tired. And like that happens. And like that could clearly happen as a physician, right? Like you can't like walk into a patient and just like sigh and sit down and like, what's wrong with you, right? Like, I hope this is easy because I'm not putting in my best effort. Like you can't do that, right? And so you are still managing some impressions. Another like now I'm like having these stories pop into my mind. We got a lecture in medical school, and I think I may have mentioned this to you, Azaii, at some point in the past. Because it wasn't in my class, it was in a different class. One of the medical students wore their white coat to the bar because they were trying to like seem fancy. And like there was a definite lecture on like all the med school classes, like, no, like you cannot do that. And so just kind of because we need to, like, as physicians, we need to manage our impression. And so, like, not that going to a bar is bad, but like, you don't want to think of your physician as somebody who's drunk, right? You don't want to think of your, like, you need to present an image as a physician, as somebody that is respectable, responsible, somebody who cares more and is self-sacrificing. And so like seeing a bunch of doctors like partying is not good, not just for those doctors, but for medicine overall. And so as a physician, you have to be a steward, not just of yourself, but of medicine. And so you need to manage your impressions that you're giving off. It's kind of an interesting thing. Most of my friends who are physicians either don't use Facebook or they use false names for Facebook. And so, so like there's a lot of my friends from medical school that I'm friends with on Facebook, but their name on Facebook is not their actual name. Because they want to kind of manage impressions, but also it's not necessarily good for a patient to be able to look up a physician and find out where they live or things like that. And like, there's some issues there. And so like that front stage versus backstage stuff, I think is very clear in that example of like being a physician, just kind of like managing those two scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so far we've been focusing on how individuals can manage their impression, and that also affects how people interact with you, right? But it's not limited to individuals. You can have organizations that through their choices influence society, right? And influence how others interact with them. And so there's this really cool term, and it kind of relates to that, and it's McDonaldsization. And so the premise behind this is actually that fast food companies can actually influence not just their consumers. There we go. That's the word I was looking for. But that can influence other organizations based on their choices, based on how they present themselves. And so the idea is, if you think about a fast food chain like McDonald's, right? They're prioritizing things like efficiency. And so they set this standard about speed, right? Of how other groups are expected to engage, and how other organizations engage with their consumers, right? There's also this idea of like quantity, right? And so this bigger is better phenomenon that we often see. And, like when you think about places, they'll often give you the option to size up, right? And then it's not just that, it's also how they present the goods, right? So this predictability, like, are you able to keep seeing the same thing over and over again? And we expect this reproducibility, not just with fast food places, but also experiences in a clothing store, right? You expect to have someone come in and offer you help. You expect your doctors, right, to behave a certain way. And so you have all of this going on, but also it has this element of control, right? So you're controlling anything that takes away that predictability, that consistency, right? And so in this control, there's definitely impression management going on there. So, we've been talking about this as it relates to individuals, but it's not just individuals, it's also organizations.
Yeah. This McDonaldsization, like, especially that predictability, I think people really underestimate how amazing it is that you can go to a McDonald's anywhere and like the same stuff is on the menu and it tastes the same, right?
Yeah.
Like just the idea that I could go to 2 McDonald's in my hometown or in my like city, Kansas City, and like they have the same menu is not that amazing, but the food tastes exactly the same. To like the amount of ketchup, the number of pickles, like the stuff that's going on with those is very much the same. And not only just like in my city, but like if I went to a McDonald's in Maine or LA, it would be the same. Also, if I went to a McDonald's in France or India, And like the idea that like they're all the same, like that's kind of amazing. And that's something that happens with this McDonaldization. It's not just about impression management, although that definitely is a huge part of it, but just a way for a business to become very successful. Like you're calculating exactly like what's going on with this. You're able to reproduce it quickly. You're highly efficient. I think that a lot of people don't realize how much effort goes into designing the kitchen of a McDonald's, right? It's actually really interesting in that they know what foods people are going to order the most. And so what they do is like they put the food pieces that you need to grab at the different places, they group them differently based on proximity to each other and how often they're ordered and things like that. So the stuff that is like you have to reach up like an extra 6 inches for, those are foods that are less often ordered. And like it's so calculated and so efficient and organized. And it's one of those things that like if McDonald's changed their menu, they have to redesign all the stores, like all the kitchens. And like they do this. And like this is such an interesting thing that like when McDonald's switched to doing breakfast or switched to being able to order breakfast like all day, like they changed the kitchens. And so the ones that do that have different kitchens than the ones that don't do that. And it's just this highly efficient way to run a business and to be like super efficient and calculatable and predictable and like all of these things. And that's just runs more efficiently as a business. You see this not just at McDonald's, but also like the most successful stores out there, the chain stores. Note that they're also like all the Walmarts are very similar. All of the Applebee's are very similar. All of these things, and they're like specifically designed by people based on these principles of McDonaldization. So it's just kind of an interesting thing kind of overall, like understanding how all of these pieces fit together. And it doesn't have to be stores either. Like a lot of businesses, like tax preparers, right? Like they all, like all the H&R blocks, like they're all the same kind of going through there. It's just kind of an interesting thing, putting all of that together. There is one more term that we wanted to talk about today. So we've talked about like roles and strain and role conflict and role exit and impression management, the dramaturgical perspective with the front stage versus backstage self, dramaturgical being like a play, and then McDonaldization. The last term, I feel like most people probably listening to this don't realize all the terms that we go through. And like, this is actually like, we're actually like pumping you guys full of a lot of info that you're unaware of. But my last term here is the Iron Law of Oligarchy, which is like one of just like the best phrases ever. I feel like that should be like the title of a book or something, the Iron Law of Oligarchy. So the idea behind this, first off, an oligarchy is a ruling class where you have certain people running the show. It's different than like communism versus like a monarchy where it's like royal families. An oligarchy is a class, so a ruling class. And so the Iron Law, the reason it's called the Iron Law of Oligarchy is that like iron is very strong and unbendable. And like the Iron Law of Oligarchy is the idea that every organization, period, will end up as an oligarchy, no matter what. And that, like a lot of people are like, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. But like the idea here is that people, like if somebody's got to be in charge of every organization, there's got to be people in charge. Those people in charge, maybe they don't want to hold on to power. Maybe they're fine passing it, but maybe they'll pass it. Eventually, somebody's going to end up in charge here who likes the power, right? Who wants to do this. And because they are in power, they can reshape everything so that they stay in power, right? And so this works with governments. This also works with like small organizations like homeowners associations or the PTA or things like that. It always ends up like somebody's in charge and they're pulling all the strings and like keeping themselves in charge. And it's this Iron Law of Oligarchy. I think there are some people that would argue that like even like democracies and even like the United States kind of fits into this. Like there are certain people and certain families and certain groups who seem to just constantly be in power or in some form of power, like the Kennedys, right? The Clintons, the Bushes. Like there's these people that just like they tend to get power and then keep it within their group. And it may not even be intentional, right? With this idea of like, I am in charge right now and I want to make this world better. Right. And there are people out there who don't want to make the world better. They're just like trying to make a mess of the scenario. And like, what's best for the world is if I'm in charge of this and the people like me. And like, so you end up with this scenario. I'm like, that is a purely selfless idea. Well, okay, not purely, but there is some selflessness there of like, for the good of people, like it's best if people or people like me are in charge because like they care about, the poor, they care about this, they like whatever. And there is something to this, but the idea eventually is like people tend to take charge and then hold on to that because they are focusing on that. And that, so everything ends in oligarchy. It's like very kind of like weird view of the world, but there is something interesting to this iron law of oligarchy. I just want to keep saying that.
Yeah. And I think it's curious because it's not just like on grand scale things. This can also happen small scale. Like if you think about, well, I guess nothing in medicine is truly small scale. But the people who try and plan, right? So you can imagine the people who try and respond to the pandemic, right? Feeling like, okay, we can do a good job at this. We'll keep going, right? And we'll continue to do so. And, if you think about like in school, right, the class president and, the people who like the treasurer, we just tend to keep them in power if they do, a decent job. And sometimes even if they don't do a decent job. But yeah, it's like, it goes from this diffuse responsibility to this more concentrated responsibility and power. And I think, like you said, it's important to recognize that, it's not always coming from a place of negativity. It can come from this feeling that you're doing what's best for the group. Yeah.
And like, once again, it's not saying that everything is always like that, but the idea is everything will end up that way as an oligarchy. And I think the idea behind this is that people who want to abuse power are drawn to power. And so they are pursuing power, and people who don't necessarily want power or want to abuse power aren't drawn to it. And so eventually you end up with scenarios where people in charge are people who want to stay in charge. Yeah. And there's just something interesting about that. I think I read a book once about like, it was like some society where in order to be in charge of the society, this is like totally unrelated, but I was just talking about this with somebody else yesterday, and the Iron Law of Oligarchy came up because of this. And so I was reading a book about the society where in order to be prime minister of this, or like president of the society, you would have to be nominated. And then you would have to write an essay on why you shouldn't be in power. And whoever is the least qualified to be in power gets put into power. And like in this society where it's an idea here, it's like that is the only world that would not have the iron law of oligarchy. Like you are being pushed, like we're pushing the people into power who don't want it and who shouldn't be, and like that sort of thing. And so it's just like a really interesting, like I can't remember I think it was a short story that I read. I'm like, that's like such a weird way to run a government, but that's kind of an interesting idea.
So I'm really curious as to what brought this up in just normal conversation. Was it because you had read that and then this person
we were discussing politics at some point and about how people like tend to abuse power. And I'm like, yeah, like I just read this book. And like, actually like the idea you're talking about is the iron law of oligarchy. And there's something to this. And like, that's as we were, celebrating our holiday stuff. And it just kind of came up and I'm like, like iron law of oligarchy. It's such a great term. And also just the idea that everything becomes an oligarchy eventually. It's just such an interesting idea and kind of helps people kind of see the world differently.
Yeah. Well, we leave you all with McDonaldsization and Iron Law of Oligarchy, so that you don't forget that studying for the MCAT can be fun. And then, going through the psych-soc section is an opportunity to just yes, you should be studying, right? But it's an opportunity to let loose a little bit and see what is curious. What a way to end the year.
Yeah.